Hi, good morning. You can hear me? A little bit louder? Is that better? Perfect, thank you. I know I have a soft voice, so I just want to make sure. So good morning. I recently completed an interdisciplinary master's program at York University in Toronto. And my thesis project began in late 2014 when I visited Toronto's Little Jamaica. In an attempt to connect with my Jamaican background in the city, I was looking forward to a space that was similar to how academic Jenny Berman described the area as it was about 10 years ago. Among other things, she described a collection of fragments, Port Royal Restaurant, Gus's Tropical Foods, Natural Touch Hair Design, the colors of the Jamaican flag, dance hall growling from Treasure Isle Records, smells of curry, pizza, and jerk, inflected by the sound of patois, barrels, and racks of stuff spilling out on the sidewalk. These smells, sights, and sounds of the organized chaos of a lively immigrant marketplace are missing from Little Jamaica today. For roughly the last 40 years, this cluster of Jamaican businesses was at the center of a transnational ethnic enclave where new immigrants and successive generations of the Caribbean diaspora integrated into Canadian society and connected with home. Now it's undergoing a series of changes that coincide with a localized economic depression and the installation of the Eglinton Crosstown Light Rail Transit Line, the LRT, which, according to the Eglinton Connects revitalization study, will be followed by an extensive redevelopment. These changes include the closure of many businesses that have been displaced by the construction of the new LRT stations, particularly at the heart of Little Jamaica. The contrast between the new developments and what is being replaced is striking and disturbing, not just visually, but for what it represents. What does it mean that these improvements and new developments do not reflect the Caribbean or even an immigrant sensibility? What does it mean when design's best practices create results that align with historical precedents of the erasure of Black spaces in Canada and the displacement of Black communities to the outskirts of Toronto? Indigenous researcher Sean Wilson makes two statements that are key to this research. He states that we cannot remove ourselves from the world in order to examine it, and that research reveals our unquestioned answers. Taking these statements to heart, I came to the understanding that, especially with regard to design and Black Canada, I would have to use a research method that allowed Little Jamaica to tell its own story, that my lens was important to this work, and that I would have to begin the work of unpacking the dissonance of what it means to be a Black second-generation Jamaican immigrant in Canada and a designer with a Eurocentric formal training. From November 2014 to December 2015, I took about 1,500 photos of the Little Jamaica market area along Eglinton Avenue West that captured attributes of the area like street furniture, store signs and facades, community art, and physical and systemic infrastructure. I avoided photographs of people whenever possible. These photos allowed me to document and to take an inventory of what I was seeing and feeling. A grounded theory approach allowed me to engage a reflexive lens as a Black designer of Caribbean descent to contextualize these photos in the experiences of the Little Jamaica and Caribbean community through interviews with a few business owners and the historical experiences of Black Canadians, and to compare my key findings to literature on design to challenge the asserted objectivity, neutrality, and efficacy of design as an egalitarian discipline and practice. By grouping similar elements and taking notes of changes over time, a narrative of Little Jamaica that emerged from the photos revealed issues with the physical infrastructure in the area in relation to traffic flow, power imbalances across communications and social infrastructure, and poor systems design in relation to the elements necessary to a healthy market area. The photos also revealed evidence of social, economic, and political issues, a history of the area being an intercultural immigrant space, and of course, displacement. These findings echoed many of the stories shared by business owners, including their feelings of being pushed out and ostracized. The narrative of Little Jamaica being displaced aligns with significant omissions from Canada's historical narrative, like the demolition of Africville in Nova Scotia and Hogan's Alley, in British Columbia, decades of racist immigration policies, and even the concealment of Canada's largest invisible slave burial ground in Quebec. Additionally, in the 1980s and 90s, housing discrimination and questionable practices by Toronto's Public Housing Authority resulted in the concentration of Caribbean immigrants in a few neighborhoods in the outskirts of the city, in the same geographic area that had the second largest Black population in Toronto and its surrounding suburbs almost 200 years earlier. So the historical inability of Black Canadians to benefit from Toronto's use of transit development due to economic, social, and physical exclusion was echoed in a 2015 study, which showed that gentrification was more likely to occur when new transit developments were placed near to low-income and immigrant neighborhoods. This unfortunately puts the Eglinton Crosstown LRT and its neoliberal redevelopment plans in line with history, including 3 LRT stops for Little Jamaica, plans to maximize profit opportunities around transit hub areas, and plans to rename Eglinton West Station Cedarvale Station. So just to quickly explain this map, so it's Toronto, Toronto West, Toronto East. The gray areas are the gentrifiable census tracts. This was a study done in 2006, and the red areas were the areas that were gentrifying at that time. The dotted blue line, was Toronto's transit line as it was then, and that blue circle is where Little Jamaica is located. So 13 years later now, the LRT line is running across that street there, that straight line there. And so as you can see here, locations that are located near the transit line are red. You can just imagine how many more areas would be red today based on the installation of the LRT line right across where Eglinton Avenue West runs. So when the photographs that I took are considered in context with the historical discourse on Blackness in Canada and the gentrifying effects of new transportation developments in Toronto, the loss of Little Jamaica is shown to be part of a larger hegemonic process of the erasure that is facilitated by design. A closer look at the history and methodology of design reveals the source of its hegemonic tendencies. Historically, the definition of design and the history of its development has been deliberately centered around Western modernization, including industrialization and mass production. This is often painted in a positive light and at the same time is used to limit the recognition of design's ties to the social, economic, and political happenings of society beyond persuasion and material consumption. It was this same modernization and industrialization on a global scale that required the exploitation that is central to capitalism and that has set into motion the series of events that led to the Atlantic slave trade and more recently, the exploitative work schemes and immigration policies of the mid to late 1900s that brought many Caribbean people to Canada. So even though reductive methodologies enabled the success of industrialization, the requirement of simplified representations, in the words of Henry Lefebvre, become violent representations because they cannot account for or recognize the diversity, conflicting notions, and social processes of urban culture. And an over-reliance of the expertise, quote unquote, of designers, often over collaborators with more relevant disciplines and life experiences to a project at hand, contributes to this violence. These representations demonstrate that designed objects, services, or techniques are not neutral. They embody social values and policies and are representations of arguments of how life ought to be lived. They also, as Bordeaux explains, embody the taste of those in power and communicate who does and doesn't belong. Despite its best efforts, due to pursuits of modernist ideals and a lack of reflection in relation to a wider historical and social context, design repeats the past by aiding the transformation of prejudice into implicit, cultural, profitable, and normal practices. From the analysis and contextualization of this photographic inventory comes my invention. What stands out in this study of the erasure of Little Jamaica is that good intentions and best practices concerning design has not worked in Little Jamaica's favor. In this and similar situations, design practitioners need to employ a reflexive critical lens to acknowledge the fact that access to design services or to the tools that designers use does not in and of itself negate systemic oppression or its enculturated effects. This is particularly true when it comes to the influence and reach of design, in that these are aspects that are dictated by factors other than design itself. Similarly, designers need to ask larger questions of the context of projects, especially since the principles and practice of design are intertwined with unspoken or ingrained preferences and prejudices like race and economic status. Failing to ask these questions positions designers to unknowingly perpetuate systemic issues. Design isn't a tool that only brings idealistic intentions to life within narrowly defined parameters. Deliberately or unintentionally overlooked aspects of projects are also created along with their positive or negative effects. Asking questions of and challenging the tenets of design will strengthen the discipline, enabling it to incorporate a wider range of experiences, applications, and agents, and evolve it beyond a tool primarily for the wealthy and powerful to the more egalitarian tool that it purports to be. Thank you.
Thank you, Debbie. Yep, no, please stay. We forgot to mention that we will take a few minutes after each presentation for questions. Are there any questions for Debbie?
Thank you, Debbie, for your presentation. I was wondering if the images that you showed are obviously you documenting the current state, or when you did the work, the current state that it was in Little Jamaica. Do you think that in order to help communities, because I'm sure Toronto is very diverse, so there's probably several communities that are suffering from the gentrification that Toronto is going through. Do you think that using these photographs or trying to build a representation, I don't know what's swinging, that trying to build a representation of the community through these photos, either by, I don't know, transforming them, giving them some sort of amplitude, or have you thought about how to use these photos to help the community build a representation for itself?
I'm in the process of trying to figure that out now. It's quite a bit of photos, and there are a lot of other dimensions that were revealed, I guess, in the body of the work. So I'm just trying to, I guess,
figure out
things and distill things. But yes, I definitely agree with what you're saying to move in that direction.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That really touches on a lot of the things we're doing in Belfast in terms of displaced communities, so it's very relevant. I think my question is more to do with the transit and how in general urban designers would advocate for transit, for a more inclusive way of moving people around, when in this case, and it's many times the case of design, very careful design that actually ends up doing the thing it doesn't want to do, which is to displace people from the spaces and their places of their community. So I wonder how that works out for you.
No, I understand what you're saying. It's a very, very, I want to say weird. It's a weird thing. because a lot of times transit is put into spaces like Little Jamaica to help kind of fix past issues of pushing immigrant communities out to the edges or to the suburbs. However, people with money and power see transit lines as opportunities to, build like real estate or to just for money, to make money. So I think it's more about how you organize who the stakeholders are around those transit spaces and where they go in. I think that there are things that you have to put into place. It's more about service design, like just better service design. So you can't just have one person from the community who's very wealthy or whatever represented on your stakeholders, your team of stakeholders. It has to be more of a wider representation of who it will be actually affecting. And also in this project, for the Eglinton Connects revitalization study, when you look at their stakeholders, the core stakeholders were the government and the business people and the construction companies, and then their external stakeholders were like not even the community. It was like the business owner, and it's like, okay, that kind of has to be flipped a little bit more. But yeah, I think it's more about how we define stakeholders and more about how we understand who is in the space and who it will be affecting, and not just always chasing money. I think communities, I also didn't include people because of issues with photo release forms, but like people make communities, and if you're only worried about how it looks and the technicalities of the flow of traffic and like those elements, you're losing a lot of people. This project was, or at least this presentation was mainly about the documentation, the photography, but in the interviews themselves, you can understand what the photography is showing in terms of, like, I heard stories of people, like, just gossip, like the grandmother that was here and the who owned that store and who bought it and who married who, and like all of that messy stuff that makes a community, and that kind of like lends to why there was script signage, like all that feeds into how design looks and to how we understand it. So, but if you're missing all of that and you're just looking for like the sleekest, newest, freshest design, then you're missing a lot of the point about why you're trying to make an ideal space, right? It becomes more of a technical practice rather than a lived practice, I guess.
Thank you, Debbie.